Okay, hi guys. We are going to be talking about chapter 10 today. It is cinema and digital arts. So we've already learned, and maybe it was the very first video lecture about Edward Muybridge and his video of the horse in motion. Um, he was able to to prove by taking this series of photographs and making them into a video that that a horse was indeed airborne for a moment. People were all disagreeing as to if a horse was ever had all of its feet off of the ground at the same time or not. So he lined up these pictures and was able to project them at the same rate like a movie. So when we talk about cinema, that just means the production of movies as an art or industry. And obviously, like we see from the Muybridge film, it was a logical extension of photography because when you take a series of photographs and you put them together, you have cinema. So we have for silent cinema, the innovation and techniques that I want to talk about. There are four different individuals. So the first one is a Frenchman named Georges Méliès. 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 And he actually started his career as a magician, but between 1896 and 1913, he directed over 500 movies. And most of them were just a few minutes long, and they were based on narration of a single event. He built his movies from a succession of shots, so they're brief, unbroken sequences of recorded action. And then between them, he would use something called dissolves, which is where it would fade instead of cut to something else. And he was able to perfect visual effects like time lapse photography, which is just, making something look like it's going really fast, and disappearances and things like that. The next person I need you to know about is D.W. Griffith, and you'll see an image in your textbook from the film Belshazzar's Feast. And Griffith was the first to use close up and long shots. So that's something that you need to know about D.W. Griffith. Then we have Lev Kuleshov, and he is a Russian director. Let's see. We don't have an image in your textbook from him, but what you need to know from that is that he discovered that viewers' emotions from one shot will persist into the next, even if the two shots are unrelated. So a shot with a smiling actor followed by a shot of a plate of food will make the food seem good. And if they show an actor like making an awful face, like a grimace or a scowl, and then they show the food, it's going to make the food seem gross. And so that technique is called the Kuleshov effect. And then the last one that you need to know about in this section is Sergei Eisenstein. And this image here to the right is, these are all separate film stills from the film Odessa Steps and or Battleship Potemkin. And the thing that you'll need to know about Eisenstein is that he used montages to add dramatic intensity. So cutting from one person to another person to another person can add intensity. And so the use of montages were something you need to know from there. So then we're moving on from starting in the 1930s, movie studios grew into large companies and they controlled mass market cinema throughout the 60s. So some things that we need to address are the fact that obviously Hollywood had a big part in this. It had very large studios in Hollywood, so it was the production site for the majority of the world's movies in the 1930s. And then one other thing I need to add is starting in 1934, the major Hollywood studios adhered voluntarily, so they made the choice to follow this thing called the Motion Picture Production Code. And it basically made profanity and certain depictions of nudity, sexual activity, drug use, even interracial romance, and ridicule of clergy. It made it sort of against the rules. Okay. It was not a law, but these large Hollywood studios all voluntarily stuck to this code. Okay. Starting in 1934. Let's see. Then we want to talk about in the 30s and 40s, animators from uh, the Walt Disney Studios started exploring possibilities of animation. We all know that animation is just hand-drawn frames that are photographed and projected in sequence. And then they were the first to create an animated feature-length movie, which was Fantasia in 1940. It integrated classical music with painting, with dance, and drama, with a mix of human cartoon characters as the stars. Um, let's see. The next thing that we want to move on to is during the 40s, a new style called film noir originated in Hollywood, and these were really kind of dark and serious and sad black and white movies. They deal with scary things like murder, but also, sometimes bad guys and maybe also ordinary people who are kind of down on their luck or they're having just a hard time. They sort of depict the dark side of an American dream. And the example that your textbook uses is this movie called Detour. Okay, and then let me go back. Even though Hollywood was definitely putting out the majority of the world's movies, there were many international directors that also made very groundbreaking movies, and your book calls them foreign directors, but I prefer the term international directors. So one of those is the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, who often adapted European plays for filtering through his own vision, and that you can read about on page 163 and 164. Let's see. And then also there is another one that you'll want to know about whose name is Federico Fellini. And he made a movie in 1961 called La Dolce Vita. So let's move on. We're going to talk about experimental cinema for a little bit. Every once in a while, careers of artists and careers of Hollywood directors and studios would come in contact with each other, and it wasn't very often, but um, one of the first examples that your text discusses is this idea of the Disney movie Fantasia. There's another one that we want to talk about, which was a combination of, or what should I say, a collaboration of Alfred Hitchcock and Salvador Dali. A lot of you may have seen, if you've been in art class, Salvador Dali's uh, surrealist paintings. Maybe you've seen the ones of melting clocks and things like that. And this movie Spellbound that they made together is a good example of experimental cinema. One other early leader in underground cinema was named Stan Brakhage. And in the 50s, he began painting directly onto the raw film, and then he would scratch through it to create abstract movies. So that's Stan Brakhage. And then the last one that we want to talk about in this section of experimental cinema is Kenneth Anger and the film Scorpio Rising from 1964. So this movie, it was experimental, but it started to influence the mainstream. Um, it it would intercut footage from other movies and music that comments on the main action of the movie, and it strongly influenced the later idea of like the biker movie. And Hollywood directors like Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese, who have made very well-known and many, many popular movies, have said that the mood-creating qualities of Scorpio Rising have also influenced their own work. So as we move into films in the 70s, there are just a couple of things that we need to point out that were happening during this time. The first is that there was increasing competition um, from television. So that was something that we need to keep in mind. People had more options on television. And then in the 70s also, the production code sort of how do I word? Um, Not as many Hollywood studios were adhering to those things in the production code that I had talked about earlier that limited profanity and sort of negative influences, things like violence or uh, any type of sexuality. And there were a lot of storylines that up until the 70s they weren't, I don't want to say not allowed to make, but according to the code, they were not allowed to make those type of storylines. Um, and then they began to start to do that. So that's when you start to see movies that address those types of storylines. And then also during the 70s, we have the this trend that was called the blaxploitation movement. And studios would employ African American directors and actors. They would put them in action adventure movies that were set mostly in urban neighborhoods. And, um, it sort of minimized the Black experience. But there is a film that your book discusses that some may say fits into that blaxploitation movement, but it also proved successful with white audiences. And you can read more about the movie is called Shaft. You can read more about Shaft on pages 166 and 167. The blaxploitation movement was controversial because it seemed to reinforce the stereotypes, but because of the movie Shaft's visual style and such a good lead character, also an award-winning musical score by Isaac Hayes, it influenced a lot in the future. So then we move into special effects and digital cinema. And the things that your text really wants you to know about are we're going to start with Star Wars. So the creators of Star Wars, there's a group called Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, and that was the special effects division of Lucasfilm, who made the Star Wars movies. They were the leading special effects studio of the 70s and 80s, and George Lucas was also responsible for the increased use of computers to edit film. It looks like I have a random bullet point just hanging there at the end. And then the movie Pan's Labyrinth, if you haven't seen that, that could be a good one for you to go back and watch, by Mexican director Guillermo del Toro. It's a Spanish and American production, and the movie is an example of international co-production. So you can also read about that film on page 167 in your textbook. And then we see a shift from traditional film to using digital cinematography, like this movie still from the movie Prometheus by Ridley Scott. When we talk about video art, the things that are really important is for you to know that the Sony Corporation set the stage for the beginning of video art in 1965 when the PortaPack came out, and it was the first portable video recording camera.